To discover new things in the field of science, countless scientists conducted experiments over thousands of years. Some of the experiments were designed to discover things about humans. Experiments were done to find out how our bodies work, how we eat and grow, and how our organs work. Some scientists pitched their tent in unlocking the secrets of the mind, discovering why we act the way we do, and what can be done to influence. The zeal for knowledge frequently pushed scientists to conduct their experiments through extreme means, which are frowned upon in present times. In 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki was formed for the medical community by the World Medical Association, WMA. Even though it is not legally binding, this declaration encourages scientists to abide by certain ethics when experimenting on humans. In February 1920, before the Declaration of Helsinki, the results of an experiment carried out by American psychologist John B. Watson was published. His research was on showing evidence of classical conditioning in humans. Classical conditioning involves learning a pattern of behavior based on consistent association with a particular stimulus, such as a sound, smell, or the presence of a specific object. For his experiment, Watson worked with his doctoral student, Rosalie Rayner, at Johns Hopkins University. After studying kids in the wild, Watson made the hypothesis that kids' fear of loud noises is an instinctive emotional reaction. To test his hypothesis, he turned to classical conditioning. He planned to use children's fear of sound to make them fear something that would normally not be scary to a child. Watson and Rayner's experiment asked 3 questions. Can an infant be conditioned to fear an animal that appears simultaneously with a loud, fear-arousing sound? Would such fear transfer to other animals or inanimate objects? How long would such fears persist? Watson and Rayner chose a 9-month-old child for their experiment. The child was referred to by the pseudonym Albert. Watson's procedure for the experiment on little Albert was similar to that used by the Russian physiologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. In the 1890s, Pavlov studied salivation in dogs in response to being fed. When the dogs were fed, he put a little test tube into each of their cheeks to measure their saliva. Pavlov observed that his dogs would start to salivate whenever they heard the footsteps of his assistant who was giving them the food, contrary to his prediction that the dogs would do so in reaction to the food being placed in front of them. Pavlov thought he had made a significant scientific discovery when he found that any object or occasion that the dogs had come to identify with food would cause the same reaction, salivating. As a result, he spent the remainder of his professional life researching this kind of learning. In his experiment, Pavlov used a metronome to get a reaction from his dogs. By itself, the metronome did not elicit a response from the dogs. Next, Pavlov started conditioning process by introducing the clicking metronome right before he offered his dogs food. After several tests of this process, he used the metronome without offering the dogs food. At this point, the sound of the metronome clicking increased salivation in the dogs. Through his experiments, he discovered classical conditioning, which is also known as Pavlovian conditioning. Now, back to Watson and Albert. Before the experiment, Albert was briefly exposed to a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, masks with and without hair, cotton, wool, burning newspapers, and other stimuli. During these baseline tests, Albert showed no fear of any of these things. When Watson's main experiment started, Albert was already 11 months old. Albert was placed on a mattress in the middle of the room. The infant was given a white rat to play with. As Albert played, Watson and Rayner hit a steel bar with a hammer. This loud noise caused Albert to react by crying. They continued this the same way Pavlov did with his dogs. They paired the noise with the rat 7 times across 2 sessions, 1 week apart. Eventually, just as the dogs salivated from only the clicking of the metronome, Albert also cried and attempted to crawl away whenever he was presented with the rat, even when the loud noise wasn't made. Albert's fear of the rat seemed to fade after a while, but repeating the experiment procedure a few times was enough to reignite the child's fear of rats. Watson conducted more experiments in which Albert seemed to generalize his response to the white rat. He would also show signs of distress when presented with furry objects like a rabbit, a furry dog, a sealskin coat, and a Santa Claus mask with cotton balls in the beard. But this reaction wasn't generalized to everything with hair. The little Albert experiment showed that classical conditioning could be used to create a phobia. In this experiment, a previously unafraid baby was conditioned to become afraid of a rat. The experiment also showed 2 additional concepts originally outlined by Pavlov. The concept of extinction showed that although a conditioned association can be incredibly strong initially, it begins to fade if not reinforced, until it disappears completely. The second concept is known as generalization. It shows that conditioned associations can often widen beyond the specific stimuli presented. An example would be a child developing a negative association with one teacher. This might make him extend this association with other teachers, just like little Albert did with the other furry objects and animals. At the end of the experiment, Albert was 1 year old. Watson had spoken about his intention to remove Albert's conditioned fears, but he couldn't work long enough with Albert to do this. By modern standards, the result of Watson's experiment isn't fully accepted. Apart from the ethical dispersions, Watson used a single subject for his experiment and had no control subjects. Some experts doubt whether Albert's fear response was a phobia. When Albert was allowed to suck his thumb, he showed no response whatsoever. This stimulus made him forget about the loud sound. It took more than 30 times for Watson to finally take Albert's thumb out to observe a fear response. Watson gave a series of weekend lectures after his experiment. In these, he described his study on little Albert. One of these lectures was attended by Mary Cover Jones. The lecture made her interested in pursuing graduate work in psychology. Jones experimented to figure out how to eliminate fear responses in children. In her experiment, she studied a boy named Peter, who was 2 years old. Peter shared similar fears of white rabbits and furry objects as little Albert. Jones was able to increase Peter's tolerance of white rabbits by exposing him to the animal. This process is known as direct conditioning. She also had Peter interact with children who were not afraid of the rabbit. Jones was the first psychologist to desensitize a fear response. She is known as the mother of behavior therapy. Today, we regard experiments like that of little Albert to be unethical, so you must be thinking, where were Albert's parents throughout the experiment, and how were they okay with Watson's procedure? It turned out that the little Albert experiment may have been conducted without the knowledge or consent of Albert's parents. There are claims that Albert's mother worked in the same building as Watson, so Albert was raised in a hospital environment from his birth. After she found out about Watson's experiment, she moved away with Albert, not telling anyone where they had moved to. Because of this, Watson was unable to remove Albert's conditioned fears. But the original report claims that Albert's mother may have known about the experiments after all. She may have felt coerced and unable to turn down a request for her baby to be used in Watson's experiment. So what happened to little Albert after the experiments? We can't know for sure because his name was never disclosed. However, some claim to have discovered his identity. According to a 2009 article by psychologists Hall P. Beck and Sharman Levinson, Albert B. was actually Douglas Merritt, the son of Arvilla Merritt. Arvilla appears to have been a wet nurse at the Harriet Lane home. Beck made this claim after reviewing Watson's correspondence and writings, as well as research in public records, such as the 1920 U.S. Census and state birth and death records. Douglas Merritt died at the age of 6 as a result of hydrocephalus, which was later discovered. According to researchers who looked at this case years later, if Douglas Merritt was, in fact, little Albert, his actions during the conditioning sessions align with signs of neurological impairment. Merritt may have had severe trouble seeing at the time of this experiment with this condition, which is when there's an accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid on the brain. Other researchers claim that Merritt may not have been little Albert. Their research pointed in the direction of William Albert Barger. Psychology researchers Russ Powell and Nancy Digdon contested the identity of little Albert given by Beck and Levinson. Their alternate identity was William Albert Barger, who was born within a day of Merritt. Just like Merritt's mother, Barger's mother also worked in the hospital where the experiment was conducted. His size and developmental state also considerably more closely matched the subject baby's condition as recorded in the trial. The researchers discovered Barger had passed away in 2007 at the age of 87. They also located one close living relative, a niece, with the help of a professional genealogist. In an interview, Barger's niece stated that she and her uncle had been quite close throughout his life. She acknowledged that Barger's dislike of dogs was a well-known fact that family members, particularly his wife, would tease him about. The researchers noted that there was no way to determine whether this behavior was related to Watson's experiment. Barger's niece also revealed to the researchers that her uncle disliked all animals, not just dogs. She claimed that she did not remember any more phobias he may have had, even though family members frequently had to keep their pets in a different room when he visited. The researchers concluded that Barger would not have been aware of his function as an infant test subject. So, what's your take on the little Albert experiment? Do you think his parents were aware of Watson's procedure? Who do you think is the real little Albert? Would you be open to volunteering your children for scientific research?